Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And today, I have somebody as a guest that I've been wanting to have for a long time, and finally, that day has come. And now, if you want to describe our guest, I would have to use the word multifaceted, and still that would be an understatement because he's done so many different things as a producer, as a singer, as a songwriter. He's been broadcasting for decades now, has a vast knowledge of anything related to classic pop, to jazz, and it's wonderful to have him right here. He might not have pitched for the Minnesota Twins, but maybe if you go a little bit deeper, he might have done it at some point. I'm not sure. The name is Arne Fogel, and it's wonderful to have Arne on the show today. Hello, Arne. Welcome to the Jazz Flashes podcast.
Hello. Thank you. What a nice bunch of stuff to say. My wife would love it if I pitched for the Twins. She's a big fan. She'd enjoy that immensely, but no chance of that. I was always the last kid picked for teams. So there's no chance of me growing up into a baseball career.
Well, I am a baseball fan myself. I'm more of a Red Sox fan than Twins fan. But my wife grew up in Missouri and also partly in Minnesota, and so she does like the Twins, although she's more of a Cardinals fan, of course.
Well, my wife and my daughter too. They're crazy. They're crazy about the Twins.
Well, I want to thank you for being here. I've been, following you on Facebook for a while, and I've been wanting to have you on the show to talk about the many things that you've done over the years, to talk about our common love of classic pop and the crooners and the great singers of the past and present and future. And but when I look at your name, Arne, I see a hint of German or Scandinavian in there. What about that?
Actually, it's Jewish. It's by way of where did they come from again? I believe that my father's family came out of Poland, and that's like 2 generations back. My father was the first. I believe he was the first in his family, a big family, 8 kids, to have been born in America. But his older siblings were born in Poland. I know that. Mm-hmm. And my mother's family, my grandfather was, I think, out of Lithuania. Mm-hmm. And his wife, my grandmother, is the only American-born grandparent who I had. But the commonality of all of them is, Jewish background. And that's what I am.
You live in the Minnesota area, in the Minneapolis area in Minnesota right now. Is that where you grew up as well?
Yep, I was born in Des Moines, Iowa, but grew up in. I don't remember living there. I certainly remember going back to visit family over the years. But, mm-hmm. I lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, from the time I was an infant. And from about age 2, Minneapolis, and that's a few lived in Colorado for a short time, but in my 20s. But for the most part, Minnesota boy.
Now, music, of course, is an important part of your life and has been for decades now. And I'm wondering what your first musical memories would be and how you became interested in music and what kind of music that was and how all of that happened.
I've always loved music. I have in my direct, immediate family, no professional musicians at all, or people who perform. But my dad was always crazy about music, and there was always a lot of music around our house. And I know as I was growing up that I occasionally watched, Westerns and things like that, the type of things that were on TV in the 50s. But the things that were the biggest in my house were the variety shows. Mm-hmm. And so my main probably influence was that we always watched not only the comedy shows, Sid Caesar and Danny Kaye and all of those people, mm-hmm. but throughout the 50s into the 60s at the variety shows. I was the only kid on my block, shall we say, after watching Bonanza for many years on Sunday nights that when Judy Garland had a series on opposite Bonanza, I stopped watching Bonanza for a season because, you know, Judy Garland, incredible legend, and great music every week. And I was only 12, 13 years old, but that's what I gravitated towards was the music. And I just loved it. And at some point in time, my simultaneous interests were always, number one, to study what they do and learn about the history of what they do, because I was just so in love with show business and entertainers and musicians. And the other half, simultaneously, as I say, to learn how to do some aspect of it myself. That's where I wanted to go. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in radio in some fashion, and I wanted to be a singer, be a musician. And and I always, I should mention too, and you can probably relate to this because in a lot of ways you're the same kind of guy that I am. I remember very early when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old that I was very, like a lot of kids my age, the Three Stooges started playing on television. Mm-hmm. And I was a big fan of theirs, and I loved, the crazy comedy and everything. And a magazine called TV Guide Junior, a mm-hmm. TV Guide for Kids, came out and told a very, for juvenile readers, a little bit of their history. And I remember I was just starving for information about performers who I liked. And I just actively remember that one case, one of the earliest awakenings of the realization that it's not enough for me to just enjoy performers, but I need to learn about how they got to be that way. Mm-hmm. Not just what their lives were, but how they formed their comedy in that instance. And that was the first time I could look back and say, geez, I've kind of always been like that. Mm-hmm.
So you were interested in the art then, in the artistic. You were more interested in the artistic side of it than maybe the private lives of these performers.
Yeah, or at least as much. I mean, their private lives were interesting too, but particularly theirs. So I mentioned that as an example. That's a wonderful growing up story that they had and how they got into show business. But in general, and then by the time I was 11, 12, 13, it was just a totality of my being, I guess, is that whereas other kids spent their time, on the ball field playing or acting, more physically active than I was as a kid, really. I just lived in the library and wanted to learn about the stuff I was interested in. I guess everybody's kind of like that, mm-hmm. but maybe a little bit more intense on my part, and that the nature of my interests was maybe a little different than most kids. I never stopped being like that. I have a library in my own home now, practically, and I take great pride in it, and it's given me great pleasure in my life to be able to, and now with the internet, there's no end to it. You can just learn anything you want about anybody that you want, and that's just always been a great passion of mine and a sort of a hobby, I guess you might say.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Judy Garland, and I wondered, what other performers were a big influence on you growing up, and what was it about show business that attracted you so much from those early years?
Well, I guess I related to it. I mean, there's the first part of your question, there's just such an endless number of performers. There are probably more performers who I like than who I don't like. Mm-hmm. But the ones that, off the top of my head, that for the longest period of my life that I can think of, that I've been a big aficionado. How's that? There's a fancy word for you. I think, first of all, of course, Bing Crosby. You and I share that interest. Mm-hmm. And he's probably certainly my number one all-time favorite entertainer. And I'm talking about before rock and roll, took over part of my brain. I loved Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis, and adore Laurel and Hardy, and Abbott and Costello, and Danny Kaye, and Frank Sinatra and all the great singers that followed in Crosby's wake. I loved Sinatra, and I loved, I can't think of all of them, Peggy Lee and Billie Holiday, and just there's so many jazz performers, and then through Crosby, when I was 12, 13, I discovered Bix, and then there's a door opening, there's a gateway drug. I love Louis Armstrong. He's like a god to me, and various other performers I collect, and I enjoy Eddie Cantor. I enjoy people of that generation, Durante. It's just Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and Harold Lloyd. It goes on and on and on. And then of course the Beatles came out. And it took me about 3 months to kind of figure out what they were all about, because a lot of my musical tastes had already been sort of cemented. I was 14. But it didn't take too long before I just became, and eventually it turns out that I'm like, in my neighborhood of all Beatle fans, I become the biggest one in the neighborhood. I mean, it figures, right? And I still am. I'm still the biggest Beatle fan in the neighborhood. I love that, Dylan and Rolling Stones and Beach Boys and Crazy About and Ray Charles and everybody I mention just opens the door to somebody else in my mind. And I'm enthusiastic about that interest still. If there's any art to anything that I do, I sometimes think that the greatest, most artistic thing I've ever done in my life is listen. It's like I'm a great artistic listener. I just have great passion in my listening habits, and I derive great joy, and more as I get older, which I'm very rapidly doing.
Well, that listening part that you're talking about also led you to the broadcasting world, because you didn't simply listen for yourself, but you were trying to expose other people to the kind of music that you enjoyed. And if you look at your broadcasting career, which extends over a few decades now, you've worked on many different and I think very interesting shows, from Minnesota Public Radio to shows like Bing Crosby on Record in the 80s and 90s, the Retro Review, Arne Fogel Presents Bing and Company, and now you're working on the Bing Shift, Bing's Basement, shows like that. How did that happen? How did you get from here to there, in the sense of, I am a listener who enjoys music, and then I get the chance to actually access the airwaves and share my passion for music with everybody else?
I think the key sort of fulcrum to that whole thing is something can be best answered by something that, once again, my wife Lori said to me, an observation several years ago. She said, first and foremost, you're a teacher. And I said, yeah, thank you. I think you're right. And just as a side issue, I did graduate from the U of M from the College of Education. So my educational background is such that if all else tumbled, that teaching was my fallback. I never really did it on a steady basis, although I've done a lot of guest lectures and taught some university courses and things. But that's sort of what I am. So I guess when I go on the radio, I don't just want to be a disc jockey, so to speak. I like to educate people in a nice way, the nice aspects of that word. And I started in the mid-'70s. I actually figured out not too long ago that I have been on the air doing something, not just as a guest, but on some show that's under my own steam, a show that I host or produce or whatever. I've been on the air at least once a week for almost 45 years. At least once a week somewhere on some station. And I'm not counting the jingles, the advertising things that I sang on and stuff like that. That I have no way to calculate. But as a, on the radio here in the Twin Cities, or that Sirius XM series that you mentioned. And so I'm proud of that. And I don't know how long it's going to go on, but at least at this point in time, I can look back and say that I've done that. And all of my shows, I did spend some time just as a staff announcer or presenter or whatever. But from a certain point on, it's always my goal to present the type of things I like, the type of program that I like. Did that for about 15 years on Minnesota Public Radio, which was great to do. I'm very proud of those shows that I did. And everything is an effort to present what I love to audiences, and to try to, once again, in an entertaining way, to try to let them know why they might like it too. Mm-hmm. And the Crosby thing being that he's, such a, he puts you into kind of an interesting place, and I know that you know this as well as I. Is there, you answer this question for me, is there a better known performer, a more universally known and recognized performer who is more widely misunderstood artistically today than Bing Crosby?
Well, that's a good question, because, I've thought many times about the fact that if you compare, for example, the impact of Bing Crosby over the decades, from the late 20s up until the 1970s when he ended his career, I've always thought that these days the singers that came in his wake, like Frank Sinatra, like Dean Martin, are better known than Bing Crosby, where Bing Crosby really was the father of them all in that sense. So I would agree with you completely.
Yes, and I think there's it's not too difficult to come up with the answers for that, reasons for that. I think first and foremost is that he's a generation, it's older than them, mm-hmm. So that's part of it. And there is, I also think, and this doesn't get emphasis enough, even on the part of, the really great Crosby students and biographers and presenters, and maybe when Gary Gibbons' third volume comes out, he'll address this, is the fact that Bing Crosby, from the 1930s on, did not do personal appearances. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that people have an image in their mind of Sinatra and Dean Martin, people like that, performing in a tuxedo with a hand mic and singing, to audiences, the foundation for that image is built over decades and decades. And you don't have that with Crosby. You mm-hmm. have him, singing in a movie or something. And otherwise his principal image is in, fishing gear or mm-hmm. with a golf hat,
Or Christmas.
And and overwhelmingly Christmas. And so it becomes a matter of Bing not being forgotten. Every time I read that Bing Crosby is forgotten, it rankles me, because it's so not true. He's extremely well remembered. But the problem is, I think he's remembered for not enough of the right things. Mm-hmm.
I think, one of the things, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but it's just something that this makes me think, Arne, is that I think the kind of image that Bing Crosby cultivated over the years, that of an everyman, of the nice fellow, the nice neighbor around the corner, who was always liable to sing a song perfectly well with a beautiful voice, beautiful baritone voice. That kind of image was not exactly the same kind of image that somebody like Frank Sinatra, for example, cultivated over the years. And to a mass audience of today, I feel like that kind of Sinatra kind of swagger that he had and that cultivated over the years is just more attractive than the image of Crosby as an everyman. What do you think about that?
I think that's true, but once again, I think it goes back to people not knowing enough about what Crosby really was and had done and could do. First of all, Bing, if you listen to the right records, Bing could swing his you-know-what off. Mm-hmm. And he a tremendous jazz influence, and he was a tremendous part of what people viewed as jazz-based singing. The whole subject of pop singing in that golden age, there was a tremendous infusion of jazz in that. I do have to say that I think that today, the situation that we're describing has been alleviated somewhat. I'm old enough to remember the 1960s and 70s when Bing was still alive, and it was much closer to his moment of his peak. And yet, I think that his contributions were less well known than they are today. There's two major reasons for that, I think, or three major reasons. Number one is it's no longer mom and dad's music. It's now great grandparents' music. And nobody's threatened by that anymore generationally. And so people can have a little bit more benign attitude toward it and not immediately reject it. The other thing, two things. One of the others is Gary Giddens' books, particularly the first, Volume 1, because which was a bestseller, a near bestseller, and really in a tremendously authentic sort of a way. Communicated to hundreds of thousands of people what Bing really was all about and what his contributions were, and I think that was an amazing had an amazing effect, and you see the ramifications of it to this very day when there are things written about the great singers of the 20th century. Bing is far more prominent than he would have been 30 years ago when they're writing about that. The other thing is, I think that the Crosby organization itself, headed by Bing's family, and they've done an amazing job of, annotating, describing, delineating, and most importantly, releasing huge amounts of Bing's legacy. And you cannot do that without having some of what accrues to that be, disseminated to the public. And there's so much more of Bing out there now than there was 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And it's so I think it's partially because of that generational gap that's grown larger. Gary Giddens' books and the Crosby organization's tremendous efforts. And so I feel a lot more gratified as a Crosby follower with the way things are now than the way they were maybe in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Bing really was looked over. I mean, there was a thing in Newsweek magazine or Time, I can't remember which one, the great voices of the 20th century as the century was drawing to a close. And, everybody's freaking uncle who could carry a tune was listed in that, but Bing wasn't. And I just, mind-boggling. I don't think that would be the case today.
Yeah, well, those two books by Gary Giddens, Pocket Full of Dreams and Swinging on a Star, are really important in that sense, as you mentioned also. Bing Crosby Enterprises reissuing those CDs, those albums on CD that are now easy to find. They're well annotated. They have great sound, and most importantly, they're out there. And if you want to listen to Return to Paradise Islands, you can do that now. And back in those days, just as an example of many possible ones. One thing that every time that I get a chance to talk about Bing Crosby in public, whether it be at the public library or on local radio for any reason, I think a lot about Bing Crosby that goes beyond the music is not known either. And I think that's something that people need to talk about a little more. And a good example of that, to my way of thinking, is I think since we're on the topic of Crosby, this is something that I would like to mention to see what you think. I think that he had a much more important role in the advancement of civil rights in America than he gets credit for, because everyone talks about Sinatra in Vegas. People talk about, of course, Harry Belafonte and Tony Bennett, and of course, later rock musicians and people from the African American community, which needs to be talked about as well. But Bing Crosby was doing some trailblazing things way before there was such a thing as the civil rights movement, and I think that's something that came out of his love for music and out of the fact that he didn't care about the religion or the race of somebody that he played or recorded with or appeared on radio with. And he did things like that, appearing with people like Louis Armstrong on radio and on film way before that was accepted in America.
Well, and I honestly don't think that it's something that he, as you say, he would have spent a lot of time really thinking about, because I don't know that he was the type of guy to agonize or really painstakingly calculate those kinds of things. I think it just occurred to him that this is a nice guy and I like his music and I'm going to have him on my show. And if somebody, complained, well, there's, racial, yap, reasons why, somebody in the 1930s felt that was not desirable, he would just say, well, the hell with you. I want to do it, so I'm going to do it. And that's about as far as it went. And so what we're left with is in a day, in an age when Eddie Lang had to bill himself as Blind Willie Dunn in order to, have the right to record with Lonnie Johnson. In other words, heaven forbid that a white guy should record with a black guy. That Bing was making records with the Mills Brothers, and that the Mills Brothers were regular performers on his show, and that the Charioteers were not only regular performers on his show in the 1940s, a black gospel group, but that they're combined in performances with the Music Maids, which is, in a sense, that's not in a sense, it's, right out there, which is, combining African American male vocalists with white female vocalists. And the people were scandalized by things like that in general. I don't know that anybody else was doing that then in the 40s. I think Eddie Cantor featured Thelma Carpenter on his program for a year or two. And that was noted by a lot of people. In an age when, when the major publications were complaining because Martha Ray appeared in a number with Louis Armstrong in a film. How dare this white woman appear with this black man? I mean, people were crazy. It was a crazy time. But we have to remember one thing. I don't know how, deep into this subject you want to get, but we have to recognize one important fact when we're talking about all of this stuff, which is the entire history of American entertainment, particularly American music, is steeped in racism. And everything every progression is a move away from that, but it represents wherever we were at the time. So whereas you can look backwards at Crosby and say, well, he wasn't too racially enlightened rather. There's a blackface number in this or that movie, which is totally unfortunate and represents part of that racism. But you have to look at the progression up from where we were that represents. And I think his record is pretty good. And of course, the stories that have to do with Louis, the one that most people know about is Pennies from Heaven. When he, once he was in charge of his own production, he wanted Louis in his movie, and he wanted to give him a prime billing, even though in essence his role is not that huge in the picture. Pennies from Heaven, because he adored him and respected him so much. And the later story, which doesn't get as much play, but I think it's fascinating, is the one about the Edsel show, which you probably are aware of, when right around the time that that Lewis was incensed about Governor Faubus and all this stuff about the kids being able to go to, black kids being able to go to schools, segregation. It was right at the height of that period in 1957, I think, is the year, 57 or 58. Mm-hmm. And Armstrong said, called him an ignorant, well, we won't go into what he called him. It was heavily censored at the time, but he was very angry, Lewis. Everybody thinks of Lewis as, smiling and happy and benign, but he was extremely annoyed, shall we say, at Eisenhower and at the powers that be for not being sensitive to the plight of African Americans in the late 50s. And just when he spouted off the most was before this big television show was going to happen that Bing was spearheading, called The Edsel Show. Mm-hmm. And the powers that be, and I can never remember if it's CBS or Ford, the sponsor, mm-hmm. or CBS, the network, but one of the two said to Bing, well, you can't have Lewis on the show. There's too much at stake, and now he's so controversial because of what he said about Eisenhower and Faubus and all of this stuff. So Lewis can't be on your show. Sinatra and Rosemary Clooney, that's fine, but no Armstrong, please. And Bing's response was, okay, no Lewis, all right. By the way, I won't be there either. And they said, what? What are you talking about? And he just said, no Lewis, no me. And they capitulated. And as Gary Giddens has stated in one interview or another, not only is Lewis on the show, but he opens the show mm-hmm. with Bing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a tribute to, and there's other stories about that too. Bing was a maverick, and nominally a Republican and a conservative, I think, in many ways, but he was a maverick. He viewed things the way he viewed them, and he was, as you say, for a man of his time, born at the turn of the last century, mm-hmm. and we have to allow for that, extremely progressive in a number of ways.
He was born just 4 years before my paternal grandfather, and I always remember thinking of my paternal grandfather as a man from another age, because he was just so old when I was born, really, but also because of some of the things he did and some of the things he said. But in the case of Bing Crosby, I feel like it's too bad that on so many levels he is known for the wrong things, or maybe not for what should be the right things, especially bearing in mind that shows like the one you mentioned, and also, of course, his radio shows from the 30s and 40s, had ratings that would be unheard of today. And for him to be doing that at a national level like that, having people like Louis Armstrong on there, and in fact, that's how I first became aware of Bing Crosby. It was through Louis Armstrong, believe it or not, because of course I knew him as the singer of White Christmas, and I had seen movies and that sort of thing as a kid. But then I heard Gone Fishing, and that was really my first introduction to Bing Crosby. And I realized somehow at that age, when I was maybe 10 or 11, well, this is the same guy that sings White Christmas, but there's something different about the way that he's singing here, And that was the jazz influence, and that's how I became interested, not just in Bing, but in jazz as a genre. So we're talking a little bit about some of Bing's contributions to the music and the culture of the 20th century. If I were to ask you, Arne, why is Bing important to you? How would you answer that question?
Well, all of the reasons that we just named and that you've just named. That he is a sort of a gateway drug, I love that term, mm-hmm. To a lot of what show business and jazz have to offer. And he certainly was for me. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, to me personally, I don't know. I suppose the first thing I was aware of him as a kid. I didn't pay too much attention as a child. I knew that my dad was a fan of Bing. I would see Bing Crosby or Frank Sinatra on TV, and I would say to myself, "Oh, there's that Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra guy that my dad likes." Not even necessarily being positive about which one of the two that it was. That was me in the 1950s when I was in my single digits. But the first real awareness is I went to see Road to Hong Kong when it came out, which was a brand new movie. Then, 1962, I was just turning 13. And I guess I was sort of looking for something. Along the line of what we talked about before. And it's interesting now because you look back on that and there's a particularly affecting Crosby in that movie. He's, I think older looking than he actually was at the time. And it's, I still like it for sentimental reasons, but it's not the greatest of the road pictures. But it moved me. I just said, this is a guy who I want to be like. That image, because I didn't have a much, what 13-year-old has any control over their life? Certainly not me. And I just liked the way he was so cool. And so that was the opening for me. And then beyond that, I also have a sort of I think people who have a instinct to collect. They're just out there, and they're just waiting for something, And it was like, oh my heavens, there's a Crosby record. Oh, and there's another one. Oh, and there's another one. And there's another one. And I've never heard of this one. And before you know it, I discovered that this was endlessly, there's so many records out there. And of course I didn't have much money, but it was, the more I learned, the more I liked it. It was just very lucky. And so he became not only an interest as a performer, but a sort of a hobby. The way some people collect model planes or something, or coins. Or
baseball cards, yeah.
Or memorabilia about baseball or whatever. It just, it covered everything. And I don't know. As I developed an interest in the music of my own time, as I, went a little further into my teens, Beatles came out. They changed everything for me. But I never let go. It isn't like, okay, none of that old stuff for me anymore. This is what I like. It was more a matter of, oh boy, something new to love along with what I already love. And it's kind of funny now. I was looked upon by a variety of people who knew me throughout those years as a little bit of an oddity, because I would listen to Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra and people like that, but also listen to the Rolling Stones and Bob Dylan and the Beatles, and it seemed incomprehensible. I received, it was not looked at kindly. I would be getting all kinds of grief at home from my family, my father and particularly. How can I listen to that crap? The younger ones. And then I'd walk out the door and I'd receive the same crap from the people my age about the other music. How can you listen to that old crap? And it taught me very early on that they're both full of it, because there's a different aesthetic for different kinds of music, and it's how well you perform that aesthetic in that type of music. And so I developed this kind of a critical philosophy very early on as a response to that. And the thing that's funny about it now is I look, on one hand, when just today as I was driving here, Crosby track, Fool Me Some More, you know that one. And it was followed by Rolling Stones singing Monkey Man, which you may know as well. And I thought to myself, geez, I kind of, dig me. I've still got that where I listen to all the different types of music. And then it dawned on me that to a young person today, they would look at my taste and say, oh, big deal. He's listening to something from 60 years ago and something from 90 years ago. It's like, it's all old. And they probably wouldn't even bother to distinguish, that one is of any other value more than the other. It's just, and it's true, my tastes of, I don't particularly listen to much new music today. A little bit. I don't dislike it. I just don't it's just not for me. That's all.
Well, what you say, Arne, really resonates with me because think about what you're saying now, and add a couple of decades to it, and that would be me. And so in the 1980s, that's what I was doing, and I was listening to the Beatles first because the Beatles were really my introduction to music. I was fortunate enough to live in a household where my father was and is a huge record collector and also book collector. He has, I'm not lying, probably about 15,000 records and about 20,000 books.
Great.
I'm not really sure how he fits them all in the house, but that speaks to your.
You have to want to.
Absolutely.
And you have to live with people who are very understanding.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and I think he was lucky in that sense with the people who were around him, and really I was lucky to have him around me as well, because then that's how I got interested in music from such a very early age. But he was the Beatles, and then through the Beatles and other singers. Maybe even before the Beatles, like Elvis and some country singers, Johnny Cash. I started listening to older music, music before rock and roll, and that's how I got to jazz. That's how I got to Bing. But I had the same problem. Most kids in the 1980s were not listening to even the Beatles, let alone Bing Crosby or Dick Haymes or Frank Sinatra, But I think there is a kind of music for each moment, and there's also a kind of music for each mood that you're in. And all of those old songs from the Great American Songbook and from Bing and others of his generation really spoke to me in a way that the music of the times didn't. And I think that's, there's something to be said about that.
And I also think, in addition to all of that, when people complain about the fact that young people, they'll always say young people don't listen today, and why don't more people know about Jack Benny or something, whatever the case may be. I always feel, and I definitely believe it to be true because I've seen evidence of it, there are always those youngsters who are going to be maybe a little bit more inquisitive or have a wider ability to appreciate that which came before. That's going to be there. But I think even more prevalent is that those things are archived. They are there. They will be there in some form or another as time rolls on. It's much easier today, in other words, as obscure as they seem, it's far easier today to hear every radio program that exists that Jack Benny ever did, way back to the early 1930s. It's way earlier to access them today than it has been at any time in history. And those people who are going to develop an interest as they get older in things from other eras, they're going to discover it. It's not going to totally disappear. You have to accept the fact that it will become the subject of scholars and archivists rather than massively popular anymore. But it's always going to be of interest to somebody. And there's going to be, we mentioned Laurel and Hardy before. They've just released some beautiful new restorations of some of their films on Blu-ray. And those kinds of things will always be of interest to somebody. Possibly not massively popular, but they will always be there for rediscovery. And I do definitely believe that. And I also believe that if you're looking for them to be, if you're going to complain and say, why isn't Bing Crosby as popular as, I can't think of somebody today. You're going to, beat your head against the wall if you think that way. For one thing, he's not alive. For another thing, his music is 50, 60 years old at the latest, practically. And not quite that old. But, and it's just not going to be, that popular. But it's going to be there for people who dig it. And also, we also have to look at the fact that, for instance, last year they released this sort of restoration, remodeling, if you will, of some of Bing's Christmas tunes with a London Symphony Orchestra. Mm-hmm. Is that the right orchestra?
I think so, yes.
And stop to think that a recording artist who started fully over 90 years ago and has been dead for over 40 years, the fact that a project like that still gets produced is a remarkable testament to his staying power. And I think I'm just really glad that I'm a fan of it, because I derive so much pleasure out of it.
That for sure speaks to the quality of Bing's recorded legacy and his music all of these years later, for sure. You're listening to a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. And today we have Arne Fogel, who is talking to us from Golden Valley, Minnesota. And since you were mentioning before, Arne, that when you do a radio show or when you do a lecture or even a concert, you're trying in a way to educate people the way a teacher would. And that really resonates with me, being a college professor myself. I wonder if you think that the appearance of the internet is going to be a positive thing for the music of the past. I think you've almost answered this question, but I have a feeling that you do have a positive view on this. Am I wrong?
Well, I mean, my view on the internet and how it impacts music is kind of convoluted or complex, shall we say. Being a musician and being a person who has made recordings and a person who's been in the business of producing another artist's recordings and trying to market them over the past decade, the internet, in one form or another, has dropped, it's like the atom bomb. Mm-hmm. It's like decimated the music business. That's not a good thing. That doesn't make me happy. You cannot, I don't know that you can find any serious musician on any level who hasn't been hurt in some way by the way that the record business, the recording business, has changed. Of course, for the average Joe who doesn't understand or care about those kinds of things, it's a wonderful boon because it's free music, and it's like it's like a music boutique. Mm-hmm. For people who I always look at them as in previous generations, they're the people that would have bought a new LP and then left it on the back window of the car in the sunlight, where it warped and they don't care. Those are the people that only listen to Spotify today. Mm-hmm. Now that may seem kind of harsh, but there are people that like to sample music. Oh, that's nice. Oh, I think that's my favorite song now. Yawn. Next. I don't have a very positive attitude toward that. Now, on the other hand, I'm a habitual, fanatical user of the internet. It fulfills my desire to learn stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think that it can be used in a powerful way, new way. There are ways that we haven't thought of yet that perhaps things are going to turn around, and people who are in the business and recording, there's always a way, and we've learned this from history. Every time technology comes along and deals a kind of a vicious blow to the way things are, there's somebody who's got the brains and the creative ability to turn it around and turn it into a positive that makes things work even better. Is somebody doing that today to save the recording business? I don't know exactly. I may be unaware of somebody else who's doing it, but no doubt it will. It's too late for me. I'm old and gray, but people will benefit in the future. But so I love it and I hate it. I shouldn't say I hate it. I love it, and I regret certain aspects. And I also feel sorry for people who only live in that, because everybody I knew, even the folks that let the records warp in the sunlight and didn't care, even those people, everybody I knew loved going to record stores when we were kids and getting it. I always focus on the Beatles when it comes to this kind of thing. Every new release, and I'm one of those people who was in the right and ripe age group for them when they first came out. When I first heard of the Beatles, I was 14 years old. By the time they were on Ed Sullivan, I was still 14. But by the time they broke up, and Let It Be came out, I was turning 21. So all those wonderful teen years, every new release was an exciting event. I can't remember any time, very few times in my life, maybe when I got married. Outside of that, I can't remember being more excited than when Rubber Soul came out.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, or when my daughter was born. I just got to cover all the bases here, or I'll be in big trouble. But what that tells you is my emotional level, my emotional peak, was my absolute adoration for people like that, and the music that, God sent us through these people. I have to get spiritual about it. There's no way yet, because it's, it's on that level for me. And I think people miss that today. It's not as exciting today because of the way that people acquire music. Just to look at, those of your listeners who may be as old as I am, or understand the history of it, just to look at that capital orange and yellow swirl on the 45 RPM, or it just was so great to acquire a music library and to have those records and play them over and over again. And, a few people understand. I remember talking to Dave Dexter Jr., who you may be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Beatle fan from his, because he's the guy who turned them down at Capitol Records for about a year. But he has a greater history in jazz and record producing and whatnot. And I had an opportunity to meet with him many years ago. And he told me that he never has gotten over the thrill of walking into a room where there's records on a shelf and realizing that those are human performances locked in time. And I totally related to what he was talking about. And that's missing for some people. Because to me, Apple Music and Spotify and all those things are really just radio. Glorified radio, because you can choose what you want to listen to at any given time. But it's ephemeral, and it passes through, and the acquisition of music is not the event that it used to be. So from that point of view, all of these things, I don't mean to be so negative and sound like an old curmudgeon, although I am. But I think that people are missing some things, that make all of this more exciting.
I am a little bit younger than you are, but I do feel the same way, in the sense that I think that there is a certain material aspect to music when you view it in the way that you do, in the way that you've described, than when you're just thinking about, a song that plays over Spotify, or, it like you said, it's kind of glorified radio in the sense that you can choose what you want to play, but it's something that you don't own materially and physically. And to me, that is important. And I remember back in, I think, 1994, it must have been, when the Life of the BBC sessions of the Beatles came out, how excited I was that it was coming out, and I was counting the days until it hit the record stores, and I went and bought it and wanted to be one of the first in town to have it, even though it didn't matter, because it was just a CD or an LP, because it was also released on vinyl, and I had both. But that's something that I think you miss when or a lot of people today that don't have that experience kind of miss that material, that physical part of music.
But of course it's arguable too, and you know, the other side of the issue is they don't care. And I'm not saying that as a pejorative. I'm saying they don't care because they don't. They care about other things that I don't care about.
Absolutely.
You know, I don't. I know first thing that comes into my mind is sports and athletics and things like that. I say without exaggeration, but based on empirical research, empirical life experience, I'm with me a lot and I know what I'm like, that I know less about sports, you know, stats-wise and history-wise, than any other adult male I have ever met in my entire life. Actually, any other adult of either sex that I have ever met in my entire life. One often thinks that men or boys know a little more about sports or are more interested in sports than women, and that's not necessarily the truth. And it's certainly around my house, it's definitely not the truth. And but the result is that there's somebody else. If I ever say that to somebody and they say, "No, I don't," you probably know more than I do. At some point in time, the conversation is going to reveal that I was right. They know more than I do. And that's not because, that's simply because I have no interest. That's what I'm in. I'm interested in this other stuff. And there's no point in arguing which is a correct viewpoint, because there is no correct viewpoint. People follow their own passions, and they're entitled to, and, you know, that's just as worthwhile as the other. But the end result is that, you know, something gets lost in time. But, you know, like we said before, some of those folks will come to realize that there is something of value in older music or entertainment or whatever, and if it's something that's going to appeal to them, they'll turn to it. It's there for them, you know. So it's all good, really, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Now, your passion, Arne, being music, you did not stop at being a listener and a collector and a student of the music and a broadcaster, but you also, at some point in your life, you began to sing, to become a performer yourself. And I wonder when that side of you began to surface and why. Because if you look at the amount of things that you've done as a performer, there's a staggering amount of things that you've done. Opening for Rosemary, Clooney back in 2001. You have several, thematical concerts that you put on about different topics related to the Great American Songbook and to the great pop vocalists of the past. You've sung with Kathryn Crosby. When did this all start? How and why?
Well, I mean, I can't imagine not singing. It's always been. When I was younger, I remember that there was a Christmas concert going to be given, and when I was in 4th grade, 5th grade, whatever, and I wanted to bow out. I felt uncomfortable with it because it's not my religion particularly, and I thought my parents would disapprove. And so I said to my teacher, I said, "Is it all right if I sit this out?" And she begged me to participate because I was one of the only, I think, 2 boys in class who could carry a tune. And so I first realized in about 4th or 5th grade, whenever that was, I guess I can do this. I remember singing class as a kid, and I remember feeling a little bit not put out, but a little. I noticed that the girls were always in tune and the boys weren't. They had these sort of dead, disinterested voices, and I couldn't do the same. I honestly wanted to not sound good because then I didn't want to stand out in that way. And I didn't know how to not sing well. So that's an early memory of that sort of thing. By the time I was about 13 or 14, of course, I was very interested in singing. And all I did was sing to records. I took trumpet for a few years and learned a little bit about music theoretically, but very little, because I relied on my ear. I guess I have a pretty good ear. And I learned to sing by listening to Bing, by listening to Frank, by listening to Fred Astaire, by listening to Nat Cole, by listening to Dean Martin, and I would sing along with their records. You may notice that there's no female vocalists, and that isn't. That's simply because women sing in a different key, and I couldn't emulate them by singing to their records because my voice was not in the same. I couldn't sing in their keys, you know, and so I would sing along with those records, and that I didn't realize at the time particularly, but I was learning phrasing, and I was learning the pulse of you know rhythm and timing and how long you wait for the turnaround and all. 101 things that you learn if you listen critically and try to apply it to what you're doing. And then when I got a little older, I got in rock and roll bands, and because as we said, I was interested in that music too. And before long, I got to where I got an opportunity to. I joined a band called The Batch that was connected to the recording studios in town and to some kind of heavy hitters in the Twin Cities, and that opened the door to the recording studios in town. And because of my ability to grasp melodies pretty quickly and sing them well, I guess, I got a job singing on commercials. And that was, huge thing for me because I'd always wanted to be in a recording studio. They were like, it's different nowadays because there's studios in everybody's basement. But then there was maybe 2 or 3 big recording studios in any, in a big town like Minneapolis. And they're the places I fantasized about as a teenager. And now I'm whatever I was, 20, 21. And I was actually singing in studios. I joined AFTRA. I joined a union, American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. Dig me. Look at me. Look what I'm doing. I was so keen on myself. And I don't know any other way to put it. I don't mean in a conceited way. I just mean like, hey, I'm living my fantasy here. Going to the studio 2-3 times a week and sing for some product and actually get paid for it, put me through college, which wasn't all that expensive a proposition back in the early 70s. But it just, and that gave me a lot of confidence. And I learned more and more through that. I learned, because I was singing in studio with some incredibly talented vocalists and musicians. And you learn from that. And I'll tell you, that was my dream, is to be in that studio situation, to be a producer, to be a writer. That's kind of what I settled on doing after a while and after my band broke up and things like that. Of course, I was in radio at the same time. I guess I was, if there's anything that you can say to criticize the way I've lived my professional life, is that I'm kind of scattered. Maybe all of those things that you were talking about, if I would have concentrated on one of them, I might have achieved more. But as it is, I never was sure which one I liked to do best, so I sort of did all of them. And in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, I began to get I realized that the Great American Songbook, I don't think it was called that then yet, but I realized that people were starting to be able to get on stage and sing those songs again. For many years, you couldn't do that. A young person couldn't do that. I mean, Frank Sinatra was singing Rod McEwen songs, and Mel Torme was singing, Red Rubber Ball and things like that. And because they were, they were separating themselves from that old, nobody wants to hear that old George Gershwin stuff anymore. But by the late 80s, that was beginning to not be true.
Well, you've had by that time you would have had Ringo Starr already doing Sentimental Journey and
Yeah,
Harry
that
Nilsson
was a
and Linda
one-off
Ronstadt, right?
phenomenon.
So it was a ripe moment for that to come back, maybe.
Yes, and even more of a vivid example, you're right about, would be Linda Ronstadt
Hmm.
in the mid-'80s. And I adore Linda Ronstadt in general. I was never crazy about her Nelson Riddle albums. I don't think that was... I think that was the one type of music that she didn't quite do all that well.
I agree.
But I mean, God knows she does everything else so beautifully that I still really love her. But anyway, there was a few singers in the Twin Cities here where I was that were starting to get out and sing those tunes, and I thought maybe I should take a crack at this. And I did, and I started sitting in, and I started working at private gigs with a fellow named Bruce Allard, a very nice man who's passed away since, who put me in a tuxedo and started, taking me out to gigs where, you'd sing for the elaborate weddings or, big corporate gigs and things like that. And I started to know some of the musicians in town and sitting in some of the clubs. And I don't know, by about 1991 or 92, I was singing in clubs and building a reputation for myself. After 25 years as a professional singer in studios and bands and things, I started carving a whole new career for myself as somebody who sang in a jazz club, with a jazz trio.
Hmm.
And that worked out okay. And I've been working steadily ever since, up until Mr. COVID
Hmm.
came along and said, no, I think you're semi-retired now.
Well, related to this, I do, being the big fan that I am of Rosemary Clooney, I have to ask you about that because if there is a singer that I admire for her ability to sing both jazz and pop and do it really well, one of them has to be Rosemary Clooney. And you did have a chance to open for her at some point back in 2001, so about 19 years ago. And then you also sang with Kathryn Crosby, Bing's second wife. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that, simply because it's just something that I wasn't aware of. And doing the little bit of research for this conversation, I found out about that.
There are the two biggest differences between those experiences, you might say right off the bat, is that I got to sing with Kathryn.
Mm-hmm.
We did duets. I did not get to sing on stage the same time as Clooney. I opened for her,
Mm-hmm.
which was, thrilling enough. But by the time she got on stage, I was, in the other room listening in the green room, But what was I going to say about that beyond that? Yeah, it was 2001, and it was her, this is such a fancy word. Are you ready?
Yes.
It was her penultimate.
Oh, so that means the next to last, right? You got it right.
Penultimate.
So next to last.
Yes, it was. She went on the next day to do a gig in New Jersey. I think it was New Jersey. And then she had to retire because, and in fact, I believe that she may have gotten information as to the severity of her illness the day of our show, because she'd been in the Mayo Clinic, which is in Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm unclear about some of that. Plus, some of it is none of my business and things like that. But I've heard that she definitely was a bit distracted that night. But she was very kind. Her manager took a picture of her and I together, which just as I mentioned that, I'm looking at right now because it's up on my wall here, and which I treasure. I had met her before. I have to tell you that I have a sister who lives out east, mm-hmm. who is not a professional performer by any means, but she has, as you might imagine, she has a number of the similar interests to mine, and she is just the type of gregarious and sharp person that she is. She has managed to forge friendships with some of these folks, particularly the era when they were doing their Four Girls Four thing.
Mm-hmm.
And she became a sought-after friend, Rosemary Clooney, particularly Margaret White, of whom I have had some connections with as well. So she knew Rosemary before I ever met her. And I met her not in 2001, but in 1983, many, many years before, when she came through the Twin Cities. I had seen her concert. And the next day I went to the hotel where she was signing autograph albums, and I bought a couple of those beautiful Concord albums that she made, vinyl at that time. And I introduced myself to her, and Dante, who she eventually married, was there unwrapping the shrink wrap and she was signing. And I said, Arne Fogel, I said, my sister, Dee Goldstein. And I'll never forget it. She just blossomed, and she turned to Dante, and she said, Dante, it's the little brother. So my sister had been really, putting out some good vibes, I guess. And she signed the album in that fashion. And so I knew her in that way, thanks to my big sister. And by 2001, she of course remembered, and she gave me some nice compliments. But she kind of kept to herself that night and did her show. Also, she was, first of all, she was ill. And she was, getting on in years, and she had difficulty maneuvering, getting around. Depended on her husband greatly for help, assistance, physically. And I could see that, not to be obtrusive, but I was so honored to be in that position. It was such a lovely thing to walk out on stage. It's a beautiful place, Orchestra Hall. And to know that I had achieved that. I'm very, very proud of it. And and then she passed away just, 6 months later, after doing one more show.
Those Concord albums that you're talking about are, to me, just as good as any of the records she made in the earlier years, in the 40s and 50s.
Oh, yeah, better than some of them. I mean, from a vocal point of view, she had a much purer voice in the 50s, of course. But she didn't swing like that. I mean, she could if she would have been given the opportunity. But maybe not. In a lot of ways, we get better as we get older. Singers do, hopefully. Certainly she did, from a rhythmical way. I know the great thing about her working with those jazz musicians, I think, on those Concord albums, is Clooney had a great beat. I mean, some of those singers, you can say, well, this one has a better voice than that one. But the all-important thing to me is where is their sense of rhythm, and how keenly do they dig into that groove. That's of primary importance to me in discussing that kind of music.
And I think in many ways, the fact that she was able to record with the musicians in the studio at the same time make those albums more interesting and just a much fuller experience for a listener than, say, the Blue Rose album she made with Duke, where they were not singing and playing together at the same time in the studio.
Yeah, that's true, and you kind of have to do that with when you're working with a trio or a quartet, which most of those records were. Not all of them, but most of them. I mean, there's something about being in that little room with that little group of people. You can't really do it with overdubs. It's just, although nowadays, when singers record those kinds of albums, they may do some fixes, we call them, where there's a little something wrong, and you because you often are recording, even when you're recording with the group, you're in isolation. physically, in the studio. So you're not locked into that performance. You can fix this or that part where you maybe went off key or you forgot a word or something like that. But I doubt that she did any of that. People from that generation, they were singing all the time. They barely had a night off. They were such total, polished, time-tested pros that they didn't, they seldom made a wrong move.
Absolutely.
And yet at the same time, I can hear, listen to Frank Sinatra, and for all the glorious, beautiful, timelessness of his art, he hits clinkers all the time, and it's like his attitude is, screw it, and he's right. There's a number of tracks where they're still great fun to listen to, but maybe he was a little careless at one point or another, and he let it go,
Yeah, I think in the case of Sinatra, the early recordings for Columbia were just so beautifully polished, and his voice is just so clear. But as he became older, of course, his voice changed and got more nuanced. And at the same time, I just think that those clinkers that you're talking about just make the record more interesting.
Yeah, and I often feel that of all the male vocalists of the 20th century, I can only think of two who actually improved with age, technically speaking. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that you can describe that. Certainly Sinatra and Clooney, that they improved in certain aspects of their art. But I'm talking about just from the purely technical aspect of their vocal ability, vocalism. The only two who actually held steady or got better would be Mel Torme and Al Jolson.
Absolutely, I have to agree. And in the case of Jolson, the improvement in recording techniques also meant a lot.
Yeah, but and that's absolutely true, because the guy recorded it. He's got records from 1911 and 12, from Jolson. But still, even into the electrical recording age, you can hear that his records from the early 30s, for instance, are not his vocal isn't as gorgeous as it is in the mid to late 40s. Everything else you can say about it is not to your taste, because it's dated, and he's obviously very old school, even by 1940s standards. But just the gorgeousness of that sort of bass baritone that he had become can't be denied. That was an improvement on what he had sounded like earlier, I think.
I am a big fan of Al Jolson's, and I love his early records. But his version of the anniversary song, to me, is hard to surpass. It's just absolutely beautiful. And that's, of course, a recording he made for Decca in the 1940s.
Yeah, those Deccas are great. I love that the fact that they've collected them now and put them all out in one package. But I love Eddie Cantor, too, who's from the same era, and he didn't have the voice that Jolson. But I'll tell you an interesting thing. Jolson had one fault throughout his career. I mean, a number of faults, which you don't necessarily have to go into. But I'm speaking from a purely musical point of view. Is that Jolson did not have a good beat. He often rushes. He rushes his phrasing, and to what extent the recordings of his era had any groove at all, and a number of them, that hadn't really been developed yet. He never quite found it. There's something that we, would describe as a sort of a quarter note swing that he never mastered, really. And Cantor, interestingly enough, because he's not really primarily a vocalist, he's a comedian who sings. He did, and he possesses an ability to hang with the band a little bit better than Jolson did. And you can hear it on certain records of his, OK Toots and Lambeth Walk. and things like that, which are obscurities to 99% of the people who are going to be listening to your show. So that's an interesting difference between the two of them. But outside of that, of course, Jolson was a far superior vocalist.
Yeah, and in the case of Jolson, it's really too bad that no actual good recordings exist of his runs at the Winter Garden in New York, because that must have been absolutely mesmerizing by all accounts that I have read, and I've only been able to read them because, of course, there's no recordings of that kind of stuff.
Right. Well, you've probably heard Crosby's description of Jolson in interviews. There's one in particular from about 1966 or 67 where he says there's never been a performer that he's ever seen in his life who could do to an audience what Jolson could do in his prime. And the interviewer said, well, you must know something about that. You must have galvanized a few audiences. Or you must have excited a few audiences. And Crosby said, no, are you kidding? I just sing a couple of songs. He said, Jolson, and they used that word. He said, Jolson could really galvanize an audience. Mm-hmm. I thought that was highly descriptive. And of course, like you say, it's something we'll never be able to know because it's not in living memory anymore.
And of course, Crosby, Crosby was also modest to a fault. So that's the typical utterance of Bing Crosby, kind of self-deprecating. No, I'm not that good a singer. Anyone could sing like me.
I kind of understand where he's coming from. It has to do with the type of singer that you are. He didn't set out to really galvanize an audience on stage. He was doing something more subtle. He mentioned Judy Garland. He said she's the only person around in later years who could do anything anywhere near what Jolson could do. And this interview was about 2 years before Judy died.
Mm-hmm. Well, Arne, there's a couple of things that I don't want to forget mentioning, before we end this really interesting conversation that, at least it has been extremely interesting for me, but there is a couple of things that I want to mention before we finish, and one of them is, 6 years after the Clooney gig, you were singing with Kathryn Crosby, and in this case it was with her, and not opening for her, but you sang with her duets, and you did so both in Minneapolis and then out in California.
I didn't sing with her in California. The shows, let me just for a second here get my memory together, because it's been a while. The shows that I did with her were all in the Twin Cities. In California, I've never mentioned this to anybody because I respect their privacy, and so I don't want to act like look what I did, that kind of thing, when it comes to this sort of thing. But for the sake of this interview, I will mention that I stayed at Bing's house for about 3 days and did some research in the Crosby archive in the basement there in Hillsborough. And that came about because of a fellow named Bob DeFlores, who's a film collector and archivist based here in the Twin Cities. And I worked on a show with him that was a part of a golf tournament that Kathryn was hosting. And that's how, and I got into that through another woman named Pat, mental blocking on her last name right now, but a PR person, Pat Lindquist, here in the Twin Cities. And she got me involved in this show, and Bob was involved too. And Bob, even though I'd known him for a while, he sort of took me under his wing and made sure that I got to be, good friends with Kathryn, and who is a delightful lady and a sweetheart, actually. I use that word sparingly. But I never dreamt that I would be in that later position that I described, able to work with her in that way. But after a couple more encounters, including that trip to San Francisco and being in the house there, she came here because she was touring and she was working. She had arranged a deal where she would be performing at this or that venue for the opportunity to sell her books. She had written her second book on Bing.
My first years with Bing and my last years with Bing, I think.
Yeah, that was the second one, and she had was touring with White Christmas, and the show was oriented towards White Christmas, and because I had met her already, and Mr. DeFlores was involved in getting her here. Some of the details are a little sketchy for me right now because this was in 2007 that I did these shows. But it ended up on stage at the Heights Theater here as one of the venues where I sang this entire show with her. And she presented it in other parts of the country, and other folks sang with her in these different venues. I wasn't the only one who got to do this, but I'm the one who got to do it here in the Twin Cities. We did a women's club here, and the Heights Theater here, and a few private, home parties here in the Twin Cities for friends of hers, I think. And I wish I had recordings of them. I do have photographs of one of the shows. And that led later on to meeting the CEO of Crosby Enterprises, Robert S. Bader, and my opportunity to be involved in producing the Bing's Basement show and doing some liner notes for some of the Crosby albums. Oh, the incredible! It's really amazing to stop and think. You start out being a fan, and you grow up listening to some of the music and everything. And even though the actual artist himself has passed on, to be involved with their organization is really a thrill. It's a never-ending thrill. It's still a kind of a pinch me thing for me to have been able to work with her, and then to be able to work with their organization, even in this limited way that I have. It is what it is, but it's something I never could have imagined, and extremely fulfilling.
You're listening to the voice of Arne Fogel, coming loud and clear from Golden Valley, Minnesota, via telephone. This is a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast that you'll be able to listen to very soon here on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson, Tennessee, in the United States of America. And as we're winding down this conversation with Arne, I have one more thing to talk to you about. Of course, we could talk about many, many things, because you've worked closely with Nancy Harms. You've produced some of her records of that great New York-based jazz singer, also Jeremy Siskind. So you have done some producing, and that would be something else we could talk about. But I would like to finish our conversation by mentioning that there are some records out there that people can acquire to listen to the voice of Arne Fogel singing, different programs of songs. And I, in particular, have two CDs here at home. One is called Wrap Your Troubles in Dreams. It was recorded back in 2001 with the Wolverines Quartet. And then there's also Let's Not Be Sensible, duets with Maud Hixson, also with the Wolverines, in this case Quintet, from 2005. And I absolutely recommend those out there. You can also listen to some songs that lately Arne has been doing and posting on Facebook, and I've been listening to them as well. But those two CDs would be a good way to get a sampling of the voice of Arne Fogel. So I would like to ask you a little bit about what the concept for those CDs were, and if you could just talk a little bit about them as we finish our conversation today.
Well, I would love to, but I would also like to mention that, especially with you having mentioned it, is to be able to tell you a little bit about the Nancy Harms
Absolutely
that I've done. The two CDs that you mentioned, those are CDs of mine. One is a solo disc with the Wolverines, which is a wonderful swinging outfit here in the Twin Cities. Wolverines big band, Wolverines groups, trio of all kind of different configurations, led by principally by Jandine Forberg, who's also the drummer, and Rick Carlson, who is the principal accompanist for just about everything I do, and on piano, and a wonderful member of that group. The first one is just a bunch of great songs that I love and that I sing, and the second one is a duet with just the most God-blessedly heavenly singer that I ever encountered, which is Maud Hixson. She just sort of stumbled over her by chance, shall I say, who had decided to try a singing career herself. This is way back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I was lucky enough to have heard her very early on, and we kind of clicked. And the culmination of one aspect of what we've done together was that CD that you have. It's mostly duets of things that she and I do together, but we each do about three, I guess it's three solo tunes on the disc as well. And I'm very proud of both of those records. Quite honestly, I'm particularly proud of the one with Maud. And so those were great projects. And I suppose anybody who's interested in them can just, write me, arnefogel.com, and there's contact information on one page there. The Nancy Harms thing. Nancy Harms is a magnificent artist who, once again, early in her career, I met at a group meeting for people who are interested in becoming a part of the jazz vocal scene in the Twin Cities. This is back in 2006. Mm-hmm. And one or two members of this group were sort of more older, established veterans, you might say, and I was one of those. And she was, when I first met her, I remember being curious as to whether or not she was related to the Harms family, the music publishers. Mm-hmm. And I found out that she wasn't. But it's just indescribable. One of the most intuitive, bright, brilliant, instinctive artists that I have ever met. And she also became a great friend. And at one point she said, let's cook something up here, if you're really interested in what I'm doing, I would be very interested in working with you on what I'm doing. And I said, absolutely. And before long, after she made her first album, she went to New York and impressed people there. It didn't take long before she was working at Birdland and eventually with our third album, Lincoln Center. She's worked all over the world. Places in Asia, places in Europe, places. We booked her into Albert Hall at one point. She's a standby favorite in Denmark, mm-hmm. Where she was supposed to be this year, unfortunately. Thank you once again, Mr. COVID. Mm. And we'll be there next month if she's able to go. But in the meantime, she's, right now we're all sort of cooling our heels. She's in New York. But we've made 4 albums together, actually. And Jeremy Siskin, by the way, is an accompanist and a wonderful, wonderful genius musician who works quite often with Nancy. And a group that he calls the Housewarming Project, he and Nancy and Lucas Pino, who an amazing trio that's brought out some of Nancy's most wonderful work. She's a great interpretive artist. Mm-hmm. She's not just a wonderful singer, but she has great emotion and great, I guess you might want to say, there's a spiritual essence to her work. She goes right to the heart. And working with her and creating with her has been one of the most amazing professional experiences of my life. I'll tell you one thing about both of these singers that I've mentioned to you, Nancy and Maud, is that I wouldn't call myself an egomaniac, but like a lot of artists, performers, maybe there's a self-centered aspect to what we do. And these people have taught me a great deal about removing my focus from myself and onto what's possible and what one is capable of doing for somebody else who is greatly deserving and wonderfully gifted. And at some point in time over the last 15, 20 years, in both of those instances and in different ways, I've realized that sometimes things are better directed towards other deserving people, possibly more deserving people. And so it's my privilege to work with these other artists who I believe in so much.
I remember reading a review of one of her performances in New York by a jazz writer that I respect and read quite often, Will Fridwald. And
oh yes.
And after reading that, that's when I first encountered some of her music, and I absolutely agree with your assessment of her singing and of her art, and having worked closely with her.
He wrote the liner notes to her third to Ellington at Night. Mm-hmm. So if you actually have that CD, you'll read his notes. That was part of a larger piece that he wrote about her and that album. That was based on a show that we wrote that we did first at the Metropolitan Room in Manhattan, mm-hmm. which actually got reviewed by the New York Times and by Stephen Holden. Just, so many wonderful milestones in her career that I'm just very, very proud of her. Proud of her and what she's accomplished. And it's all due to great exponential talent. And so that's been my most fulfilling professional activity of the last 10, 12 years, I think.
Hmm. And finally, besides that, Arne, what other projects are you working on now that we're all staying home, or at least a lot of us staying home due to the pandemic? What things are you working on right now that you may be able to tell us about for either right now or the near future?
Well, I took a shower today and clipped my toenails after. And those are the major, and of course getting interviewed by Anton. And tonight we're getting takeout at a deli, and I'm eating a Reuben. That's about the extent of my professional activity. No, I'm underselling it a little bit. There's a wonderful venue in town called Crooners, and it's a place I've worked a real lot in recent years, and they. Because it's operated by some very, very brilliant people, Mary T. and Andrew Wallish, Mary Chesbolt and Andrew Wallish. They've devised a way to continue with the performances by having them socially distant and outdoors. And so I've continued to work there. And there's another club in town, a small, actually a restaurant, we're going to be working under, the right conditions there next month, really for the first time since all of this stuff started. And so it's beginning to open up again a little bit in a very tasteful and appropriate way. Outside of that, there's always something cooking. We have a new album that Nancy put out late last year. Our marketing plan got somewhat sabotaged by the conditions under which we're all living. Mm-hmm. But right now I'm, trying to devise some way around that, because it's a wonderful material, original material. Nancy's first album of all original songs, except for one. And I'd like to do one more album myself. Whatever an album constitutes anymore, as we've discussed over, quite a bit, mm-hmm. the business has changed so much. But I'd like to do a sort of a retrospective thing, put some things together that have never been released before, and have that sort of final album. And outside of that, I'm I have a wonderful family. I have a beautiful wife of 42, 1978. You do the math. But
42.
Years, and a daughter who's sort of living with us part time again. Since COVID,
Mm-hmm.
and they make me so grateful. In the midst of all of this frustration, and it is frustrating. It's really punched a hole in so many things for so many people, but it's I feel very fortunate in the midst of it all. I'm 71 years old, and life could be worse.
Well, we are happy for you for that, and definitely wish you the best of luck with any of those projects that you're talking about, and you'll always have a place to come talk about them anytime you want here on the Jazz Flashes podcast. And I want to thank you, Arne. It has been an absolute pleasure for me to get a chance to chat with you. I've been wanting to do this for quite a while, and it's finally happened, and it definitely has exceeded my expectations. So thank you so much.
It's exceeded your expectations because I talk too much.
No, I mean that's the point of the show, just to have a conversation about interest that we share, and it definitely has been a delightful one for me. So I appreciate your time and your being here on my YouTube channel, Anton GF, on the Jazz Flashes podcast.
Anton, it's totally my pleasure, and it's great talking to you, and I enjoyed it very, very much. And all my best to your listeners.
If anybody is interested in the music and in the career of Arne Fogel, you can go to arnefogel.com. That's arnefogel.com, and you'll find lots of information there, and also a way to link with those CDs of his and the ones that he's produced by Nancy Harms and others. And I definitely recommend that everybody out there go check out his website, arnefogel.com. Thanks again, Arne.
Thank you.
This has been a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. Mine is the copyright of this episode, and it's also Arne's because he actually talked more than I did. It was recorded live right here in Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America in the month of August of 2020, and you'll be able to listen to it very soon on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. And as always, thank you very much for listening. We'll see you again before too long, and until then, remember what old Ellington used to say, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Bye-bye, everybody.